The silence in Marcus Croft's penthouse study was not a peaceful one. It was a manufactured, expensive silence built from soundproofed walls and triple-paned floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the sprawling, glittering expanse of Manhattan. The air itself seemed curated, carrying the faint, almost imperceptible scent of aged leather from the first-edition books lining the shelves and the subtle, earthy aroma of the polished mahogany desk that dominated the room like a sacrificial altar. From this height, 60 stories above the city, the world below was a silent, intricate tapestry of light and shadow, a kingdom of immense power and wealth that felt both immediate and impossibly distant. This was a sanctuary of capital, a golden cage where the noise of ordinary life could not penetrate. It was within this gilded vacuum that Elena Ortiz moved, a ghost in a crisp, gray uniform, her presence as deliberately unobtrusive as the hushed hum of the climate control system. She was a master of invisibility, a skill she had perfected over 2 long, arduous years. Elena's movements were a study in quiet efficiency, each step measured, each action precise. As she polished a silver water pitcher, her reflection was a distorted, elongated figure, a woman defined by her function rather than her form. The uniform, a simple, modest garment, was both her armor and her camouflage. It allowed her to navigate these opulent spaces while remaining utterly unseen, a necessary component of the household machinery, no more worthy of notice than a lamp or a chair. But beneath the starched collar and the placid professional expression, a different woman existed entirely. This other Elena, the real Elena, was a prisoner of circumstance, her mind a razor-sharp instrument that was being slowly blunted by the relentless, monotonous rhythm of domestic service. Her hands, now expertly wiping away a non-existent smudge, had once flown across the pages of legal texts, underlining complex torts and deconstructing convoluted contracts with an almost intuitive grace. Inside the quiet fortress of her mind, the scent of lemon polish would sometimes give way to the phantom smell of the Columbia Law Library, a rich, comforting blend of old paper, binding glue, and focused ambition. She had been the star of her class, a prodigy in contract and trust law, her professors speaking of her future in reverent tones. That future had evaporated in a single, devastating phone call. The memory was a scar, eternally fresh, a place her thoughts returned to in the darkest hours of the night. It was the memory of a hospital hallway, its sterile air thick with the smell of antiseptic and quiet despair. It was the image of her father, a proud man who had built a successful construction business from nothing, reduced to a fragile, bewildered figure in a hospital bed, his voice stolen by a massive stroke. The stroke had been triggered by the complete and total loss of his life savings. Every penny he had ever earned vanished into a sophisticated Ponzi scheme that had promised security and delivered only ruin. The financial devastation had been absolute, forcing Elena to abandon her scholarship, her dreams, and her future to become the sole caregiver for the man who had given her everything. Now, her life was a relentless cycle of calculations, the primary one being how to meet the staggering $4.783 monthly cost of his specialized care facility. Her encyclopedic knowledge of fiduciary duty and contract law, once her greatest asset, now felt like a cruel joke. It was a powerful engine with no vehicle to drive, a secret language no one around her could understand. As she arranged coasters on a side table, her mind would instinctively dissect the legal structures around her. She would mentally redraft her own employment agreement, closing loopholes she had spotted in the boilerplate language. She would analyze the complex trust structures that governed the Croft family fortune, a fortune so vast it was more like a sovereign entity than a personal bank account. She saw the world not as a series of events, but as a series of contracts, obligations, and potential liabilities. This unique perception, this razor-sharp legal acumen, was a skill she believed she would never use again. It was a ghost limb, a constant, aching reminder of the life that had been stolen from her, a life of purpose and intellectual combat, now replaced by the silent servitude of polishing another man's silver and ensuring his comfort. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed. The heavy oak door of the study swung open, breaking the monastic quiet. Julian Croft entered the room not as a guest, but as one who believed he was its rightful master. He was Marcus's younger brother, a man who wore his second-hand status like a tailored suit, expensive, well-fitted, but ultimately belonging to someone else. A cloud of an aggressive sandalwood cologne preceded him, a scent that seemed determined to conquer the room's understated elegance. He moved with a restless, predatory energy, his eyes scanning the opulent surroundings with a mixture of envy and entitlement. He barely registered Elena's presence, his gaze sweeping past her as if she were a piece of furniture. To men like Julian, people in uniform were not individuals. They were functions, extensions of the environment, and she was simply the mechanism for delivering refreshments. He was the antithesis of his brother's quiet, formidable power. Julian was loud, his charm a thin, slick veneer over a deep well of arrogance and resentment. Following him into the room was Leo, Marcus's 18-year-old son. The young man was the opposite of his uncle in every conceivable way. He was soft-spoken, with a kind, open face and an air of gentle uncertainty. He offered Elena a small, apologetic smile as he passed, a gesture of acknowledgement that was so rare in this house it felt like a gift. Julian clapped a hand on his nephew's shoulder, a gesture that was meant to look avuncular but was possessively tight. He guided Leo towards the large mahogany desk, his voice a smooth, conspiratorial purr. He was playing the part of the worldly mentor, the cool uncle initiating his naive nephew into the secrets of their rarefied world. He retrieved a thick, leather-bound folder from his briefcase and laid it on the desk with a theatrical flourish. The weight of it, the richness of the leather, gave it an air of immense importance, a sacred text of finance. Elena had been instructed to serve iced tea. She prepared the tray in the adjoining kitchenette, the clinking of ice cubes against crystal glasses sounding unnaturally loud in the charged atmosphere. As she re-entered the study, Julian was leaning over the desk, his finger tapping a page inside the folder. His voice was laced with a patronizing warmth, the kind of tone one uses for a particularly slow child. He was explaining something to Leo, using a torrent of financial jargon that was clearly designed to impress and confuse rather than to clarify. He was a wolf cloaked in the language of the shepherd, and every instinct in Elena's body screamed that the lamb was about to be led to slaughter. She approached the desk, her movements as silent and unobtrusive as she could make them, intending to place the drinks down and retreat to the shadows as she was paid to do. It was then that the moment happened, the one that would alter the course of all their lives. As Elena reached the desk, Julian looked up, his face a mask of mild irritation at the interruption. He didn't make eye contact. Instead, he made a small, dismissive gesture with his hand, a flick of the wrist that was meant to erase her from his reality. His words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a physical blow, each one dripping with the casual cruelty of unchecked privilege. "Just put it on the table, Elena. The men are discussing business you wouldn't understand." He then turned back to Leo, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips, a look that was meant to draw the young man into an exclusive circle of power, a circle defined by wealth, by gender, and by the deliberate, public humiliation of the woman standing beside them. He used her as a prop to inflate his own importance, reinforcing the chasm between their worlds. In that frozen moment, as the condescending words hung in the air, something inside Elena shifted. It was not a loud, explosive crack, but a silent, seismic event deep within her soul. The humiliation was a familiar sting, one she had endured 1,000 times, in 1,000 different ways, since her life had been upended. But this time, it was different. The specific brand of Julian's arrogance, the smug certainty, the effortless disdain for someone he perceived as beneath him, was a perfect echo of the man who had destroyed her father. Though she did not yet recognize his face, she recognized his spirit. It was the spirit of casual destruction, of lives ruined as collateral damage in the pursuit of wealth. A cold stillness settled deep in her bones, a glacial calm that sharpened every sense. The faint scent of his cologne, the whisper of the expensive wool of his suit, the gleam of the gold pen he pushed towards Leo, it all came into hyper-focus. Her hands, holding the heavy silver tray, did not tremble. They became unnaturally steady. Her breath did not catch in her throat. It deepened, becoming slow and controlled. The image of her father, frail and silent in his sterile room, flashed behind her eyes, not as a source of pain, but as a source of fuel. The insult was no longer just an insult. It was a trigger. The invisible maid was about to become visible. The world seemed to slow, the ambient hum of the building's climate control fading into a distant whisper. Elena felt the weight of the silver tray in her hands, not as a burden of servitude, but as an anchor in a suddenly turbulent sea. The condescending words, "business you wouldn't understand," did not just echo in the opulent study. They reverberated through the damaged corridors of her own history, striking a chord of memory so painful and so precise it stole the air from her lungs. It was the same tone, the same casual, dismissive arrogance that had preceded her family's ruin. The men who had swindled her father had spoken with that same slick, unearned confidence, treating his life's work as a trivial game for their own enrichment. A fury, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, began to form in the pit of her stomach. It was not a hot, reckless anger, but a focused, clarifying rage that solidified her resolve, turning her spine to steel. The years of forced invisibility, of swallowing pride and biting her tongue, coalesced into a single, unshakable point of pressure behind her eyes. She was no longer just a maid, she was a witness. Her heart, which should have been hammering against her ribs with fear or indignation, instead found a new, steady rhythm. It was the calm, measured beat of a predator that has just caught the scent of its prey after a long and patient hunt. The professional mask she wore every day, a carefully constructed facade of deference and pleasant neutrality, did not crack. It dissolved, revealing the formidable intellect that had been lying dormant beneath. Her mind, a finely tuned legal instrument, began to whir to life, the rust of disuse burning away in the heat of the moment. She saw the scene before her not as a family drama, but as a legal proceeding. Julian was the perpetrator, Leo the vulnerable victim, and the leather-bound document on the desk was the weapon. The scent of sandalwood cologne was no longer just an annoyance. It was the smell of fraud, of predatory intent. Every detail of the room, from the way the light from the window glinted off the gold pen in Julian's hand, to the trusting, naive expression on Leo's face, became evidence in a case that was now, suddenly, open. She took a deliberate step forward, her rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the polished hardwood floor. The silence she commanded was more profound than the one she had been paid to maintain. She reached the great mahogany desk, the symbolic altar of Croft family power, and placed the silver tray down. The gesture was not hurried or nervous. It was precise, intentional. The crystal glasses, filled with amber-colored tea and glistening ice, settled onto the wood with a soft, definitive click that cut through the tension in the room like a judge's gavel. It was an announcement. An interruption, an act of defiance so subtle that at first only its effect was felt, a ripple in the placid surface of the established order. Her movements were imbued with a new kind of grace, not the self-effacing grace of a servant, but the coiled, economic grace of an expert preparing to demonstrate her mastery. She did not retreat. She stood her ground, her posture subtly altered. Her shoulders, usually held in a posture of respectful unobtrusiveness, were now squared, her head held high. For the first time in 2 years, she allowed her gaze to meet Julian's directly, and in her eyes there was no fear, only a clear, unwavering light of pure focus. Just as Leo, his brow furrowed in a slight, youthful confusion, picked up the gleaming gold pen, The study door opened again. Marcus Croft entered, a man whose presence was the source of the room's quiet power. He was taller than his brother, with a stillness about him that made Julian's restless energy seem cheap and performative. His eyes, sharp and analytical, took in the scene in an instant. His son, poised to sign a document. His brother, leaning over him with a predatory smile. But before Marcus could utter a single word, before he could question the tableau before him, another voice filled the space. It was a voice he had heard 1,000 times offering coffee or confirming an instruction, but it was now completely transformed. It was calm, clear, and resonant with an authority that seemed to come from a place of absolute certainty. "I apologize for the interruption, Mr. Croft," Elena said, her tone perfectly even, betraying none of the seismic shift occurring within her. Her eyes, however, were fixed on the young man at the desk. "But, Leo, you must not sign that document." The words were simple, yet they landed with the force of an injunction, freezing the pen just inches above the paper. Julian's head snapped towards her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and outrage. The smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a contorted mask of fury. Who was this woman, this non-entity, to dare to interfere? He opened his mouth to unleash a torrent of vitriol, to put her back in her place, but Elena gave him no opportunity. She turned her head slightly, her gaze now locking onto his with an intensity that made him flinch. The invisible maid was looking at him as if he were a specimen under a microscope, and she was the one holding the lens. Her voice remained level, but it took on a sharp, clinical edge, the voice of a seasoned attorney, dissecting a flawed argument in open court. "The document you've presented to him as a fun investment game is, in fact, an irrevocable power of attorney, specifically drafted to circumvent the protections of the Uniform Trust Code. You have defined principal in a way that includes all future assets, not just the initial seed fund you mentioned." Each word was a perfectly aimed dart, striking with lethal precision. She was not emotional, she was factual. She was dismantling his entire scheme with the cold, hard tools of the law. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with a stunned silence. Leo's hand holding the pen had frozen completely, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrified understanding. Marcus stood motionless by the door, his face an unreadable mask of shock, his analytical mind struggling to process the scene. A household employee was quoting trust law with more fluency and precision than his own corporate lawyers. Elena continued, her focus unwavering, her voice cutting through Julian's sputtering attempts to interrupt. "Furthermore," she stated, "Section 4, subsection B, contains a waiver of fiduciary duty clause, cleverly disguised as a discretionary investment authority. This clause would legally absolve you of any responsibility for losses incurred through gross negligence, effectively giving you a license to gamble away his entire inheritance with zero legal recourse for him. It is not an investment tool. It is an instrument of financial plunder, designed to strip a beneficiary of his assets while shielding the trustee from all liability." She had not glanced at the document. She was reciting its fatal flaws from memory, from a single, fleeting glimpse she had caught while approaching the desk. The full power of her intellect, so long suppressed, was now on full, devastating display. Julian was rendered speechless, his face draining of all color. The slick charm, the veneer of worldly sophistication, had been stripped away, revealing the petty, grasping fraud beneath. He looked from Elena's unflinching face to his brother's stony expression, then to his nephew's look of betrayal. He was trapped, exposed by the one person in the room he had considered less than human, a piece of the furniture that had suddenly stood up and spoken in the language of his own damnation. He had been so blinded by his arrogance, so certain of her insignificance, that he had conducted his crime in plain sight, never imagining that the silent witness to his greed was, in fact, the judge and jury. The carefully constructed world of Julian Croft, built on a foundation of lies, charm, and his brother's name, was beginning to crumble around him, and the architect of his destruction was a woman in a simple gray uniform, a woman whose name he had used only moments before as a punchline. The shockwave of Elena's words finally receded, leaving a vacuum of pure, unadulterated rage in its wake. Julian, finding his voice at last, did the only thing a cornered animal can do. He attacked. But he did not attack her arguments, for he knew they were irrefutable. He attacked her. He attacked her status, her position, her very existence within this world. "She's a maid," he shrieked, his voice cracking with a desperate, impotent fury. He pointed a trembling finger at her, his face a grotesque mask of indignation. "What in God's name would she know about any of this? She's a servant. She cleans the toilets." The words were meant to be a weapon, to reduce her back to her station, to remind everyone in the room of the social order he believed was immutable. He turned his desperate plea to his brother, his eyes begging for reinforcement, for a return to the reality he understood. "Marcus, this is absurd. It's preposterous. You can't possibly listen to this nonsense. Fire her. Fire her right now for this disgusting, unforgivable insolence." He was trying to turn the exposure of his crime into a test of familial loyalty, a question of power. He was framing Elena not as a protector, but as an insurgent who had violated the sacred boundaries of class and decorum. His tirade was a frantic attempt to regain control of the narrative, to paint himself as the victim of an outrageous breach of protocol by an uppity employee. He needed Marcus to side with him, to restore the natural order of things where brothers were trusted and maids were invisible. His voice echoed in the soundproofed study, a raw, ugly sound that was a stark contrast to Elena's calm, measured takedown. He was flailing, his corporate jargon and smooth charm replaced by the raw, primal scream of a man who has just been publicly and completely unmasked. The accusation of insolence was his last, desperate defense, an appeal to a world where a person's worth was defined by their job title, not by the content of their character or the truth of their words. As Julian's face twisted in that familiar, sneering rage, something deep within Elena's memory clicked into place with the sickening finality of a lock snapping shut. It was not just the arrogance she recognized anymore, it was the face. The specific curve of his lip as he spat the word insolence, the cruel glint in his eyes as he tried to destroy her. It was him. The memory, buried under years of grief and struggle, erupted into her conscious mind with brutal clarity. She was no longer in a billionaire's penthouse study. She was back in her family's small, modest living room in Queens. The air was thick with the smell of her mother's freshly brewed coffee and the faint, sweet scent of the roses on the windowsill. And sitting on their worn floral sofa, exuding an aura of trustworthiness and success, was a younger Julian Croft. He had called himself a wealth management consultant then, his smile just as slick, his promises just as golden. He had looked her father in the eye, a man who had built his construction business with calloused hands and unwavering integrity, and he had sold him a dream of a secure retirement, a future free from worry. The connection was so visceral, so overwhelming, that for a moment the world around her seemed to fade to gray. She could hear his voice from all those years ago, a smooth, reassuring baritone, explaining the fictitious returns, dismissing her father's cautious questions with a wave of his hand and a charming laugh. He had been the architect of her family's destruction, the Ponzi scheme that had consumed her father's life savings, that had triggered the stroke that stole his voice and his vitality, that had shattered her own future. It had a face, and that face was now contorted with rage, standing just a few feet away from her. The fight was no longer just about protecting Leo, a young man she barely knew. It was now about everything. It was about her father, lying silent in a sterile room, the cost of his care, a crushing weight she bore every single day. It was about the law degree she had been forced to abandon, the future of justice and advocacy that had been stolen from her. It was about avenging a crime that had gone unpunished, a wound that had never been allowed to heal. The cold fury within her intensified, but it also clarified. This was not a coincidence. This was a reckoning. The universe, in its own cruel and circuitous way, had delivered her family's destroyer directly to her. He had sought to humiliate her, to use her as a stepping stone for his own greed, without ever realizing that he was confessing his sins to his most determined victim. The stakes of the moment escalated exponentially. This was no longer about a job or a single act of fraud. This was about a lifetime of pain, a quest for a justice she had long ago believed was impossible. Julian's demand that she be fired, which moments ago might have instilled a flicker of fear, now sounded like a hollow, pathetic threat. What could he possibly take from her that he hadn't already taken? He had taken her father's health, her family's security, her own dreams. A job was nothing. A job was a cage she had been living in, and he had just handed her the key. A profound and terrible calm settled over her. The kind of calm that comes when you realize you have absolutely nothing left to lose, and everything to fight for. The fear of unemployment, the constant grinding anxiety about paying for her father's care, it was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a purpose so immense and so righteous that it burned away all doubt. She had been living her life as a ghost, a passive observer haunted by the past, but in this room, confronted by the very man who had created her ghosts, she felt a resurrection of her old self. The brilliant, tenacious law student, the fighter who had been top of her class, was awake. She had spent 2 years polishing silver and arranging furniture, but her mind had never stopped being a weapon, and now, at long last, she had a target. She would not be fired in disgrace. She would not be silenced. She would be the instrument of his downfall, not just for what he had tried to do to Leo, but for what he had already done to her family and countless others. Marcus Croft's gaze shifted from his sputtering, enraged brother to the woman standing with unshakable composure by his desk. He saw her not as a maid, but as a force. He saw the conviction in her eyes, the irrefutable logic of her words, and the raw, undisguised panic in his brother's. He was a man who had built an empire by reading people, by distinguishing truth from deception in an instant. And in this moment the truth was as clear and as bright as the city lights outside his window. He took a step forward, his silence a more damning verdict than any shout could ever be. He ignored Julian's frantic, pleading eyes and focused entirely on Elena. He saw the intelligence, the pain, and the formidable strength she had kept hidden for so long. The established order of his world had just been turned upside down, and he knew, with the certainty of a man who trusts his instincts above all else, that she was the only one who could set it right. He took a breath, his voice low and steady, a stark contrast to his brother's hysterics. He did not ask if she was sure. He did not ask for proof. He asked the only question that now mattered. "Elena," he said, his voice cutting through the tension, "tell me everything." The silence that descended upon the study after Julian's forced exit was a different kind of quiet than before. It was no longer the sterile, manufactured silence of wealth, but a heavy, weighted silence, thick with unspoken history and the raw, exposed nerves of betrayal. Marcus Croft stood near the mahogany desk, not as the master of his domain, but as a man suddenly adrift in his own home. The familiar landscape of his life revealed to be a facade. He looked at Elena, and for the first time, he truly saw her. He saw the years of suppressed grief etched in the fine lines around her eyes, the fierce intelligence burning behind a veil of professional deference, and the unyielding strength in her posture, a strength that had just saved his son from a devastating mistake. The gray uniform she wore seemed to dissolve, replaced by the aura of a warrior who had been fighting a long, silent war. His mind, accustomed to processing billion-dollar mergers and complex algorithms, struggled to reconcile the two images, the quiet, efficient Maid, and the razor-sharp legal mind who had just disarmed his brother with a few perfectly chosen sentences. The foundation of his world had been shaken, and he knew, with a chilling certainty, that this woman held the key to understanding the true nature of the cracks. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, wild rhythm that belied her calm exterior. The adrenaline of the confrontation was beginning to recede, leaving behind the cold, terrifying reality of what she had just done. She had defied her station, exposed a member of the family she served, and in doing so, had likely thrown away the only source of income that kept her father alive. Yet, looking at Marcus Croft's face, she did not see the anger she expected. She saw a deep, unsettling confusion, the look of a man whose compass had been shattered. His question, "Tell me everything," was not a command from an employer. It was a plea from someone who had just discovered a traitor in his own bloodline. Taking a slow, steadying breath, she felt the image of her father's vacant stare in the nursing home flash through her mind, and it was not a memory of weakness, but a wellspring of strength. She had spent 2 years in silence, suffocated by the weight of her past. Now the dam was about to break, and she could only pray that the resulting flood would cleanse rather than drown her. The decision was made in that instant. She would not hold back. She would give him the whole, unvarnished, devastating truth. She began to speak, her voice low and steady, a stark contrast to the emotional cataclysm she was describing. She transported Marcus from his gilded penthouse to a small, humble living room in Queens, painting a picture of a life built on hard work and simple integrity. She described her father not as the silent, broken man he was now, but as the vibrant, proud craftsman he had been. A man whose calloused hands could build anything, a man who believed in the fundamental goodness of people and the sanctity of a handshake deal. She spoke of her own dreams, of the scent of old books in the Columbia Law Library, of the thrill of unraveling a complex legal argument, of a future that had seemed as bright and limitless as the Manhattan skyline outside his window. She did not infuse her story with self-pity. She recounted the facts with the same clinical precision she had used to dissect Julian's fraudulent document. It was a testament, a legal brief of a life that had been stolen, and as she spoke, the personal became universal, a story of trust betrayed and futures annihilated by casual, predatory greed. As the name of the investment firm, Sterling Vanguard Associates, left her lips, she saw a flicker of recognition in Marcus's eyes. It was a name from a past he had tried to forget, a scandal on the periphery of his world that had ruined thousands of small-time investors a decade ago. But Elena brought it from the periphery to the very center of the room. She described the man who had come to their home, the consultant who had charmed her skeptical father, who had dismissed her own youthful, legally informed questions with a patronizing smile and a wave of his hand. She described his tailored suit, his confident smile, and the slick, reassuring cadence of his voice as he promised a future of security. And as she detailed the face of her family's destroyer, she did not need to say his name. Marcus's face had already gone pale, a mask of dawning horror. The final, terrible connection was made. The architect of Elena Ortiz's private hell was his own brother, Julian Croft. The revelation hung in the air between them, a toxic, radioactive truth that poisoned the very atmosphere of the room. The weight of her story settled upon Marcus Croft, and for a long moment he was utterly still, his face a stone carving of disbelief and revulsion. The brother he had known, the charming, irresponsible but ultimately harmless parasite he had carried for decades, was a fiction. In his place stood a monster, a predator who fed on the dreams of good, hard-working people like Elena's father. The betrayal was twofold. The attempt on his own son's future was a wound, but the knowledge of Julian's past crimes, of the lives he had shattered with a smile and a lie, was a profound moral stain on the Croft name itself. A cold surgical anger began to replace his shock. It was the anger of a builder who discovers a deep, structural rot in the foundation of his house. He looked at Elena, at the immense dignity with which she had carried this unbearable burden, and a wave of shame washed over him. He had lived in this house with her for 2 years, seeing her every day, yet he had never truly seen her at all. He had been as blind as his brother, albeit in a different way. His blindness was one of privilege, of a life so insulated from ordinary struggle that he had failed to recognize the quiet desperation and formidable strength moving silently through his halls. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and stood before her not as a master to a servant, but as one human being to another, brought together by a shared, ugly truth. The power dynamic in the room had been irrevocably altered. She was no longer just an employee. She was the sole witness to a crime that defined his family, and he was no longer just her boss. He was the brother of the man who had ruined her life. He saw the path forward with absolute clarity. This was not a matter to be handled with a quiet payoff or a stern family lecture. Julian had not made a mistake. He had revealed his nature, and that nature was cancerous. It had to be cut out, completely and without mercy. Justice, he realized, was owed, not just to Leo, but to Elena, to her father, and to every other faceless victim Julian had left in his wake. His voice, when he finally spoke, was devoid of all emotion, a flat, hard statement of intent. "He will not get away with this," Marcus said. It was not a promise. It was a verdict. "I will place every resource I have at your disposal. We will not just stop him, we will dismantle him." The alliance was forged in that moment, a silent contract sealed not with a signature, but with a shared purpose born of betrayal and a thirst for righteous justice. The following morning, the study was transformed from a sanctuary of quiet power into a war room. The first call Marcus made was to a man named Arthur Vance, a name spoken in hushed, reverent tones in the circles of corporate espionage and high-stakes litigation. Vance was a legend, a former investigative journalist turned private investigator, a bloodhound who could find a single incriminating document in a mountain of shredded paper. He was a relic from a bygone era, a man who wore crumpled linen suits, drank his coffee black, and believed that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always left a ghost. He arrived at the penthouse not with a briefcase, but with a worn leather satchel, his eyes, the color of faded denim, taking in the opulent surroundings with a cynical, unimpressed gaze. He had seen 100 men like Marcus Croft, men whose wealth could bend reality, but he had never started a case under circumstances quite like these. Marcus introduced Elena not as his maid, but as his lead counsel on this matter. The title was both an honor and a declaration of her new role. Arthur Vance's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch as he looked at the young woman in a simple, borrowed dress, but any skepticism he might have felt vanished the moment she began to speak. Elena, armed with a legal pad and a pen, did not tell her story again. Instead, she laid out a plan of attack. She spoke the language of discovery, of subpoenas, of piercing the corporate veil of the shell companies Sterling Vanguard had used. She identified the specific statutes of limitation, the potential avenues for both civil and criminal liability, and the precise types of evidence they would need to build an ironclad case. She was not a victim seeking revenge. She was a brilliant legal strategist mapping out a campaign. She transformed her personal pain into a set of clear, actionable objectives. Vance listened, his cynical expression slowly replaced by one of grudging, and then genuine, admiration. He had worked with the best lawyers in the city, but he had never encountered a mind so sharp, so focused, and so personally motivated. The hunt began not with a bang, but with the quiet, methodical work of excavation. Arthur Vance and his team of forensic accountants and digital investigators descended into the cold, digital archives of the past. They were chasing the ghost of a 10-year-old crime, a Ponzi scheme that the authorities had considered closed. The first few weeks were a grueling exercise in frustration. They waded through mountains of old court filings, defunct corporate records, and the digital debris of bankrupt shell companies. It was like trying to reassemble a shattered mirror in the dark. The trail was cold, the witnesses had scattered, and the money had vanished into a labyrinth of offshore accounts. For Elena, these weeks were a test of her resolve. She spent 16 hours a day in the study, which had become her new home and office, poring over documents on a high-resolution monitor, her eyes burning with fatigue. At night, she would lie awake, the ghosts of her past whispering doubts in her ear. Was this a fool's errand? Was she just reopening a wound that could never truly be healed? During these moments of doubt, she would pull out her phone and look at a photo of her father. It was taken before the stroke, at her high school graduation. He was standing beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his face beaming with a pride so pure and so powerful it seemed to radiate from the screen. He was wearing a slightly too tight suit, a symbol of his determination to give his daughter the best of everything, even if it meant sacrificing his own comfort. That image was her anchor. It reminded her why she was doing this. It was not just for vengeance. It was to restore a fraction of the honor that had been stolen from this good, proud man. It was to give a voice back to the man who had lost his own. Fueled by that love, she would return to the mountain of data, her focus renewed, her determination hardened into an unbreakable shield against despair. She was no longer just fighting against Julian. She was fighting for her father, and that was a battle she was simply unwilling to lose. The first crack in the wall of silence came from an unexpected place. While sifting through a public forum for victims of financial fraud, one of Vance's junior investigators found a series of anonymous posts from 7 years ago. The post detailed the inner workings of the Sterling Vanguard scheme with an accuracy that could only have come from an insider. They spoke of a charismatic junior associate who specialized in targeting small business owners, people who had built their wealth with their hands and were unsophisticated in the world of high finance. The description was a perfect match for Julian Croft. The posts were a desperate, cathartic scream into the void, ending with a lament that the real criminals, the ones who had charmed the victims face to face, had walked away scot-free. The anonymous poster had used a handle, Justicia_84, and had gone silent after a few weeks. It was a long shot, a digital needle in a planet-sized haystack. But it was the first real lead they had. It took Vance's team another week of relentless digital forensics to trace the ghost. They followed a trail of deleted accounts and old IP addresses, a breadcrumb path leading them across a decade of internet history. Finally, they found her. Her name was Amelia Vance, no relation to Arthur, a woman now in her late 40s living a quiet, unassuming life as a librarian in a small town in upstate New York. A decade ago, she had been Julian Croft's personal assistant. She had been the one who scheduled his appointments, who listened to his triumphant phone calls after closing a deal, and who had ultimately been fired and forced to sign a draconian non-disclosure agreement when the scheme began to unravel. She was the keeper of his secrets, a silent witness to his crimes. Getting her to talk would be the key to everything. She had been threatened, silenced, and had spent 10 years trying to forget the part she had inadvertently played in so much suffering. Marcus arranged for his private jet, but Elena insisted on going alone. She knew that a billionaire and his high-powered investigator would only intimidate the woman. This required a different touch. It required a connection, a shared understanding of what it meant to be a victim of Julian Croft's world. She arrived not in a limousine, but in a simple rental car, dressed not in a power suit, but in a plain blouse and slacks. She found Amelia in the local library, a quiet sanctuary of stories, a place where the truth was cataloged and preserved. Elena didn't approach her with legal threats or offers of money. She approached her as one woman to another. She sat down at a small table in the history section, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, and she told Amelia her own story. She spoke of her father, of the life that was stolen, and of the man who had done it. She laid her own vulnerability bare, offering it as a bridge of trust. Amelia listened, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a book to her chest like a shield. For a decade she had lived with the crushing weight of her complicity, the guilt of her silence. She had been a young, ambitious woman who had been dazzled by Julian's charm and the promise of wealth, only to realize too late that she was working for a ghoul who feasted on the life savings of good people. She had been terrified into silence, convinced that Julian and his powerful connections would ruin her if she ever spoke out. But as she listened to Elena, she saw not a threat, but an opportunity for redemption. She saw in Elena's eyes the same pain she had seen in the faces of the elderly couples Julian had fleeced, the same quiet dignity he had sought to crush. Elena was not just offering her a chance to testify, she was offering her a chance to reclaim a piece of her own soul. The dam of Amelia's silence finally broke. She went home and returned an hour later with a small, unassuming shoebox. Inside, preserved for 10 years, was her secret. It was a backup hard drive, a copy of Julian's work computer she had made on the day she was fired, an act of self-preservation she had never been brave enough to use. The drive contained everything. It had his client lists, annotated with cruel, dismissive notes about their vulnerabilities. It had the internal emails, where he bragged to his superiors about his commissions. And it had the ledgers, the raw, undeniable proof of how the money flowed from the victims' accounts directly into his own offshore holdings before disappearing into the larger scheme. It was the smoking gun. It was the Rosetta Stone of his crimes, a perfect, unassailable record of his greed. It was more than enough to send him to prison for a very long time. While Elena was securing the final piece of the puzzle in upstate New York, Julian Croft was beginning to unravel. The initial shock of his public humiliation had given way to a gnawing paranoid fear. His brother had cut him off completely. His calls went unanswered, his access to the family accounts frozen. He was isolated, adrift without the financial and social safety net he had always taken for granted. He felt the invisible walls closing in. He started seeing shadows where there were none, convinced that every car that parked on his street was a surveillance van, every unfamiliar face a private investigator. He spent his days frantically shredding old documents, his nights wiping his digital footprint, a desperate, futile attempt to erase a past that was now actively hunting him. He made a series of panicked phone calls to his old associates from the Sterling Vanguard days, men who had also escaped justice, but his calls were met with cold, terrified silence. They, too, felt the shift in the earth, the stirring of a ghost they all thought had been long buried. Julian's arrogance, his greatest weapon, had been replaced by the terror of a man who knows the executioner is coming, but does not know when the axe will fall. Elena returned to the city not as a victim, but as a general on the eve of a great victory. In the penthouse study, she, Marcus, and Arthur Vance assembled the final weapon. It was a dossier, bound in the same rich, dark leather as the fraudulent document Julian had tried to force upon Leo. But this was not an instrument of theft. It was an instrument of justice. The first section contained the power of attorney agreement, a cold reminder of the crime that had started it all. The second section was a meticulous, detailed account of Julian's role in the Sterling Vanguard scheme, supported by Amelia's sworn affidavit and the damning, irrefutable evidence from the hard drive. The final section was the most powerful of all. It contained the personal stories of a dozen other victims Vance's team had located. Families like Elena's who had been ruined, their lives forever altered. Each story was a testament to Julian's depravity, a chorus of voices demanding a reckoning. Elena held the completed dossier in her hands. It was heavy, not just with the weight of paper and ink, but with the weight of years of pain, of silent suffering, and of a daughter's unwavering love for her father. The stage was set. The plan was in place. The time for the checkmate had finally arrived. The study, once the stage for Elena's humiliation, had been meticulously prepared for its final act. It was no longer a space of servitude, but a courtroom of her own making, the imposing mahogany desk now her bench of judgment. An electric tension hummed in the air, a palpable force that seemed to vibrate in the thick, triple-paned glass of the windows. Elena stood beside Marcus Croft, not behind him or to the side, but as an equal. The simple, borrowed suit she wore felt less like a costume and more like a skin she had finally grown back into, its sharp, professional lines a physical manifestation of the formidable intellect it contained. Her posture was erect, her hands resting calmly on the back of a leather chair, her gaze fixed on the heavy oak door. Inside, her heart beat a slow, powerful, deliberate rhythm, a war drum counting down to the final charge. She felt the ghost of her father's proud smile, not as a painful memory, but as a benediction, a silent anointing for the battle ahead. The years of quiet suffering, of swallowed pride and bitten tongues, had been forged in the crucible of her grief into a single, perfect weapon, the truth. And she was now, at long last, ready to wield it. There was no fear left in her, only a profound, clarifying calm, the stillness that comes when one's purpose is absolute and their cause is just. Julian Croft was ushered into the room not by a butler, but by Marcus's head of security, a silent, imposing man whose presence was a clear and ominous message. Julian's appearance was a portrait of a man in rapid decay. The bespoke suit was rumpled, his face was pale and unshaven, and his eyes, usually glinting with arrogance, were now wide and skittish, darting around the room as if searching for an escape route that did not exist. His usual cloud of aggressive sandalwood cologne was absent, replaced by the faint, sour scent of fear. He saw Elena standing beside his brother, and a flicker of his old, sneering contempt returned, a desperate, reflexive attempt to reassert a power dynamic that had already been obliterated. He opened his mouth to spit an insult, to demand an explanation, but Elena gave him no time to arm himself with his usual bluster. With a movement that was both graceful and final, she stepped forward and placed a single, leather-bound dossier on the polished surface of the desk. The sound it made was not loud, but it echoed in the silent room like a gunshot. "We thought we should begin with your most recent work," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion, as cold and clear as the winter sky outside. "The document you referred to as a fun investment game for your nephew, Leo, the one designed to strip him of his inheritance." Julian stared at the dossier as if it were a venomous snake. He sputtered, a string of incoherent denials and accusations, his words tumbling over one another in a frantic, clumsy pile. He called it a misunderstanding, a simple family matter, a gross overreaction by a hysterical woman who had no place interfering. He tried to appeal to his brother, his voice taking on a wheedling, pathetic tone, but Marcus remained as silent and as immovable as a granite statue. As Julian's blustering reached a fever pitch, Elena calmly placed a second, much thicker dossier next to the first. Its dark leather cover seemed to absorb the light in the room, a small block of pure darkness on the gleaming wood. "And then," she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout, "we can discuss your past work, specifically your time as a wealth management consultant with a firm called Sterling Vanguard Associates." The name hit Julian like a physical blow. He flinched, a visible full-body recoil, as if she had struck him across the face. The last vestiges of color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly, grayish white. He knew, in that instant, that this was not about Leo anymore. This was an exhumation. A ghost from a grave he had spent a decade believing was sealed forever had just risen to drag him down into the dirt. This was the moment Elena had replayed in her mind 1,000 times in the quiet, desperate hours of the night. But the reality was more satisfying than any dream of vengeance. She was in complete control, the conductor of his destruction. She began to speak, laying out the contents of the second dossier with the dispassionate precision of a surgeon announcing a terminal diagnosis. She detailed the names of the families he had ruined, the small business owners, the retirees, the hard-working people whose trust he had cultivated and then betrayed. She described the flow of money from their modest bank accounts into the labyrinth of shell corporations, and finally into the offshore accounts bearing his name, a fact verified by the digital ledgers recovered from his old assistant's hard drive. With every word she spoke, another layer of Julian's carefully constructed reality was stripped away. He was no longer the charming rogue, the clever operator. He was a petty thief, a parasite exposed in the harsh, unforgiving light of documented proof. He sank into a chair, his body seeming to collapse in on itself, his hands trembling uncontrollably. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. He looked at Elena, truly looked at her for the first time, and in the depths of her calm, steady eyes, he saw not a maid, but the face of every single person he had ever wronged, a silent chorus of ghosts, gathered to witness his final, pathetic end. The silence that followed was absolute. All of Julian's lies, all of his charm, all of his defenses had been rendered to ash. He was naked, exposed, a hollow man with nothing left. He turned his gaze one last time to his brother, a silent, desperate plea for a mercy he had never shown to others. He was searching for a flicker of the old familial bond, a lifeline of blood and shared history to pull him from the abyss. But the face that looked back at him was that of a stranger. Marcus Croft's expression was one of cold, profound disgust. The love he had once felt for his brother had been surgically removed, cauterized by the revelation of his true nature. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it carried the immense, crushing weight of a final judgment. "You are no longer my brother," he said, each word a chisel chipping away the last of Julian's identity. "You are not a Croft. You are a common criminal, and you will face the consequences." He nodded to the head of security, who stepped forward and placed a firm hand on Julian's shoulder. The fight was gone. The arrogance was gone. All that remained was a whimpering, broken shell of a man who was led from the room without another word, leaving behind only the faint, lingering scent of his fear. The heavy oak door clicked shut, the sound of a tomb being sealed. Type, Justice, in the comments if you got chills when Elena finally exposed the truth. In the months that followed, the world outside the penthouse moved on, but for Elena, it was an entirely new world. The news of Julian Croft's arrest and subsequent conviction was a brief, sensational story in the financial papers, a tale of greed and betrayal among the city's elite. But for Elena, it was a quiet, personal victory that resonated in the deepest parts of her soul. She visited her father every afternoon, not in a rush between shifts, but with the unhurried calm of someone who finally had time. The care facility no longer smelled of anxiety and financial strain. It now smelled of the fresh flowers she brought each day. She would sit by his bedside, holding his still, warm hand, and read to him. She read from the classics, from poetry, and from the dense, complex legal texts she was once again studying. One afternoon, as she read aloud a passage about restorative justice from one of her new textbooks, she felt a faint, almost imperceptible pressure on her hand. She looked down and saw her father's fingers curled slightly around hers, a flicker of acknowledgement in his tired eyes. In that silent, profound moment, she knew he understood. The honor of their family name had been restored, not through vengeance, but through the unwavering pursuit of truth. The wound at the center of her life had not vanished, but it had finally begun to heal. Marcus Croft had been true to his word, and then some. He had not only funded the completion of her law degree at Columbia, but had established a new, independent entity in her name, the Ortiz Justice Initiative. It was a multi-million-dollar foundation with a single, clear mission: to provide elite, pro bono legal services to the victims of financial fraud, the very people the system so often left behind. Elena was given full autonomy as its lead counsel. Her new office was not in a gilded penthouse, but in a modest, accessible building downtown, a place where people who had lost everything could walk in and find not just a lawyer, but an ally who understood their pain on a cellular level. The woman who had once been invisible in a gray uniform was now a beacon of hope, her name synonymous with the fight for the common man against the predatory forces of unchecked greed. She had transformed her greatest trauma into her greatest purpose, using her encyclopedic knowledge of the law not to build wealth, but to rebuild lives. Her journey had come full circle, from a victim of injustice to its most formidable and compassionate opponent. Her days were now filled with the work she was born to do. She spent her hours poring over documents, not to polish silver, but to find the hidden clauses that stole futures. She stood in courtrooms, her voice clear and steady, speaking for those who had been silenced by shame and powerlessness. She saw a reflection of her own father in the faces of her clients, and it fueled her with a relentless, righteous energy. She was no longer just Elena Ortiz, the brilliant law student, nor was she Elena Ortiz, the invisible maid. She was a synthesis of both, a woman whose formidable intellect was now guided by a profound and hard-won empathy. She had reclaimed the life that had been stolen from her, and in doing so, had dedicated it to ensuring that no one else would have to suffer the same fate. The quiet dignity she had fought so hard to maintain in the face of humiliation had become her armor, and the truth, her sword. She had learned that true power was not measured in dollars or square footage, but in the courage to speak up for what is right, even when your voice trembles. If Elena's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.